I'd like to call to order the Assembly work session on the subject matter is recommendation for denial of tax incentives, peach investment. And I'd like to start with Mr. Training.
Dick Training Assembly?
No, I want to be quiet. I want to start over here with introductions, Mr. Dunbar, for the record.
Forrest Dunbar Assembly. Bill Evans?
Pete Peterson.
You're allowed to talk now. Dick Training Assembly.
Ellie Gray Jackson.
Robert Harris, CFO.
I'm Marcus Hartley with Northern Economics.
Bill Falsey, the Municipal Attorney.
And can everyone in the audience please introduce
Sure.
yourself?
Terrence Trank with Pinchot Investments.
Two Potter Hotel.
Barbara Kraft, David Richmond. Over here.
I'm Ralph DeWare with the Municipal Attorney's Office.
Deanna with the Municipal Attorney's Office. Lauren works for the Mayor's Office.
And in the back, please.
Rose Foley, Assembly Vice President.
Last row.
Chris Judy, Office of Economic Development.
Thank you, thank you. Mr. Harris, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair?
Yeah. You have somebody on the phone?
Oh, I'm sorry, who's on the phone?
This is Patrick Flynn. I'm sorry, I have a sick little boy today, so I'm tuning in remotely.
Well, thank you for joining us, Mr.
My pleasure.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to make this a fairly brief presentation, and this is I'm essentially going to walk through the recommendation memo that's part of the package for Tuesday's meeting. And I'll just kind of go through and start with go through the agenda. The plan today is I'm going to walk through the summary and recommendation. I'll talk about the background and timeline, the application requirements under AMC Chapter 1235, an application review by section, chapter and verse type of thing. Then I'll have Northern Economics come in and give information on their analysis that they did as part of this analysis effort, and then any questions you might have. Does that sound like a reasonable approach? Okay. One thing I will say, just to sort of start off, there's a little bit of a discussion about when the applicant submitted the application, certain documents were under AO 2015-49 intended to be confidential, such as the applicant's financial statement. And there were certain other documents that they also intended to have as confidential, and we're still at this moment sort of negotiating with the applicant about when or if that protection would expire. So since I think that's not been resolved, everything I'm going to say today is intended to be public information as part of the public information process, and the documents and items that were intended to be confidential, we won't be discussing those today. So my intention is not to bring any of those things up. And so if you ask me a question, I may have to say I may have to just do a little checking before I can answer, depending on what the question is.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So with that, just walking through the summary and recommendations and the recommendation memo. Under AMC 1235, I'm required to provide a recommendation to the Assembly and the Mayor, and this is the recommendation. The applicant submitted an application for tax incentives focused on a multi-use high-rise structure that incorporated elements of the existing 4th Avenue Theater, the Key Bank building, some of the adjacent lots, alleys, and streets. The development was described as pre-conceptual by the applicant. The application requested 10 years of real property tax exemption on new construction and 5 years of real property tax deferral. In this case, the recommendation is because of the pre-conceptual nature of the application, it's impossible to demonstrate that the requested tax abatement is necessary to ensure the feasibility of the project, which is, as we will see, one of the requirements of AMC Chapter 1235. It's also impossible to adequately quantify the measurable public benefits that would merit an abatement of taxes for the deteriorated properties covered in the application. Based on this detailed review, we determined the applicant did not meet the requirements of AMC Chapter 1235 and are therefore recommending a denial of their request. A little bit of history. Back in May of 2015, AO 2015-49 was passed by the Assembly that designated deteriorated area status for the Reed Building, the 4th Avenue Theater, and adjacent real properties in the downtown business district and for the Northern Lights Inn property. It required that they submit an application to the Chief Fiscal Officer by September 30th, 2015, and they did. AO 2015-49 also granted fee waivers or discounts for disposal of demolition materials from the Northern Lights Inn from the Anchorage Regional Landfill, and it treated as proprietary any additional financial information filed with the application. AMC Chapter 1235. Applications for tax exemption submitted under this chapter must meet the requirements of AMC Chapter 1235. That includes a description of the property, evidence that the exemption or deferral is necessary to the economic feasibility of the project with a reasonable likelihood of long-term economic viability. The application must also show that the project promotes or improves the economic development of the municipality and requires evidence that the exemption or deferral will provide measurable public benefit commensurate with the level of incentive granted, and a financial statement of the applicant and other information as required. The applicant, as I sort of covered earlier, requested a 10-year tax exemption on new construction commencing on the January 1st following substantial completion or beneficial occupancy of the 4-5 project. That's their name for the 4th Avenue Theater Key Bank building rebuilding development project. A total of 5 years of tax deferral, some of which may be used during construction, with any remaining years to be used upon completion of the exemption period. And deferred taxes would be repaid in equal annual amounts without interest over a 10-year period after the exemption and deferral periods expired. So a timeline. They submitted an application on September 30th, 2015. Receipt of the application triggered a review period that was required within 90 days after receiving the application from his designee or contractor. The negotiations regarding treatment of confidential materials was completed in late October 2015, and that's essentially the time at which I opened up the envelope and started reading. Review of the application began, and fairly quickly we determined that we'd have to have a contractor to assist us in the analysis. I contacted 3 firms, selected one, Northern Economics. They began their work in December 2015. We met with the applicant and their consultants on January 14th. Northern Economics submitted their analysis on March 22nd, and under AMC 1235, 90 days after March 22nd is June 20th, 2016, is the due date for the CFO recommendation. So, just kind of by the numbers, chapter and verse, AMC Chapter 1235, 010A1, they provided a description of the property. A.2 was not applicable. A.3, the property met the requirements of the chapter. And I'll say this with respect to the recommendation memo, that some of the sections that weren't applicable, I simply skipped through them and didn't list them. But I probably should have had a footnote to explain that. So you'll see some things in this. You'll see some notes that jump from one section to another, but it's simply because they weren't applicable.
Can we pause for a moment?
Yes.
I'd like to recognize that Mr. Littleton has joined us for the record. Thank you. Please continue.
Okay. Forward to A.4B. This is one of the principal elements of this chapter, that the applicant must provide evidence that the exemption or deferral is necessary to the economic feasibility of initiating a project with a reasonable likelihood of long-term economic viability. In this case, based upon my review, that was not provided. This is a but-for test. If it wasn't for this property tax exemption deferral, the project would not be economically feasible. The definition of necessary doesn't include situations where the project is otherwise feasible, but the applicant desires a tax abatement to be incentivized to undertake the project. So necessary is that little extra bit that gets the project to the point of financial feasibility. Continuing on with this section, the applicant submitted a preconceptual description of what is possible. The project in description and scope is subject to modification. Therefore, the applicant did not present a project for evaluation under this chapter. In the simplest terms, it could have hotels, it could have condos, it could be, it could change as they went out to the marketplace and determined what was actually going to be something that they could undertake. They discussed 2 options in their application. One was if the project was undertaken with tax incentives, and the other if tax incentives were not granted. Under that second scenario, construction of a small, modest 2 or 3 story office building could be built was their position. The first option, a pre-conceptual application that proposed a high-rise structure, 20+ stories, a couple of levels underground that might be built with tax incentives, but it might not be built, depending upon the final identity of potential investors and users, whether the adjacent public areas can be acquired, market conditions, supply and demand factors. So, the pre-conceptual nature of the applicant's project meant that it wasn't possible to demonstrate the necessity of tax incentives to the success of the project. Based upon a review of the confidential financial information provided by the applicant, outside financing will be required for the project. It's not clear that the proposed incentives will increase the return on costs enough that the project could satisfy the requirements of outside lenders. This is one of the areas where, because I'm now sort of touching on their submitted personal financial information, that I'm going to be careful about not disclosing how much money they might have to borrow, but suffice it to say, a significant portion of the cost of the project would have to be borrowed for this project. Going on, 4.d, the applicant did provide evidence that the exemption would promote or improve the economic development of the municipality. They calculated present value of taxes of $33.8 million over 40 years, taking into account the deferrals and exemptions. If they didn't do this project and just left the structures as they were, not considering the 2 or 3 story building, the property taxes would be about $5.8 million over 40 years present value. So you get a net benefit then by subtracting those two present values of $28 million. If they didn't get the incentive and built a 2 or 3 story building, those numbers weren't provided, so it wasn't really possible to say, what this revised calculation would look like based upon perhaps an increase in taxes if the incentives were not granted. Under measurable public benefits, 8.5, the applicant cited the increased tax revenues over a 40-year period of $28 million. That's the number we just saw calculated, as the measurable public benefit. But then, because of the preconceptual nature of the application, they were in a world now where if a hotel was built, bed taxes would be received. But if not, then they wouldn't. So it's somewhat difficult to give credit for measurable public benefit under those circumstances. They did discuss jobs being created during construction and afterwards. They made estimates on the number of construction jobs and permanent jobs. Northern Economics, I think, will probably be discussing that, so I will leave that to them. They did talk about other benefits, such as activating a currently underutilized block and possible new market rate housing in downtown Anchorage. Didn't have a quantifiable number, a little difficult to measure. They suggested other benefits related to the 4th Avenue Theater building, stating the project would incorporate some of the key elements of the 4th Avenue Theater building by either preservation, restoration, or recreation of economically feasible elements of the building into the project's design. They didn't specify what those key elements would be or what the standard for determining economic feasibility would be. It's therefore not possible to evaluate the public benefit from this effort. The applicant, 8.6, the applicant did provide financial statements, and 8.7, during the meeting on January 14th, one key question, and this is something that I asked, I think 3 times, and Mr. Schutte in the room, I think, probably asked again, was how would we work with this applicant in the months and years ahead to be able to better understand what this project was as they move forward? How would we be able to shape these tax exemptions and deferrals to help make this a successful project? The father, Mr. Fang, each time, and perhaps with greater clarity each time, made it very clear that if it wasn't in the application, that that he wanted us to rely solely on the application they had presented as the means of determining what they were asking for. As a result, that was really the question that we had and it was, we were directed to go to the application to find that answer. Accordingly, we didn't request additional information after the conclusion of the meeting. Under additional considerations, going back, the preconceptual nature of the application doesn't establish what the project would be. Under the terms of the proposal, if a smaller structure were built, it would still qualify for the incentives. So if this ended up being 6 stories or 12 or 18 or something else, under the terms that they had proposed to us, they would still qualify for an exemption and deferral. That leads us to a certain risk that I think we'd want to be careful about. If we approve tax incentives for a pre-conceptual project, if the project has to change, the developer, knowing that they've got a signature on a page that says you could build 813,000 square feet, 20 plus stories, it'll have this, it'll have that, as they go out into the marketplace and realize that 600,000 square feet is what they need, or 750,000 square feet is what they need, and instead they have a piece of paper, they know they've got tax incentives at 813,000, we've incentivized them in some respect to perhaps go for a project that may no longer be feasible. Alternatively, if the project is in fact no longer feasible and they come back and say, hey, we'd really like to renegotiate, we've got all this stuff lined up, it's going to be 500,000 square feet, it's going to be 12 stories, and no retail, we'll have a bowling alley, it could be any number of things. That then puts the municipality in the somewhat difficult position later of saying, well, that wasn't what we signed on for, that wasn't what we thought we were going to do, and now you have a construction equipment out there, you've already bought the steel, you're already moving forward, and that's not the project we had envisioned. One additional consideration, they discussed in their application parking provided by ACDA without demonstrating that the parking garage was feasible or would require a study, or subsidy rather, sorry. And so with that, I'm at the end of essentially the recommendation memo, and with that I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Hartman.
Thank you.
I'll need just a minute to load the presentation up.
In fact, let me bring this down. Let's see.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Marcus Hartley. I'm president of Northern Economics. We were asked by the municipality to study this project, to look at both the confidential and non-confidential information that were provided in the application. We had signed confidential non-disclosure waivers, so we did have access to that information. And we went through it and developed an analysis of the information put forward by the applicant, and wrote up a report that we submitted to the municipality. And we also developed a kind of non-confidential executive summary. Has that been made available to the public, the
Yes,
executive
it has.
summary? That has been made available to the public. This presentation also relies only on the non-confidential information that was part of their application, doesn't go into the information that was considered to be confidential by the applicant. There were three key aspects of our approach. First, we looked at the feasibility of the project with and without the abatement. We then studied whether the proposed abatement and will provide measurable public benefits proportionate with the level of the incentive granted. And We then looked at the ability of the proposed abatement to promote or improve the economic development of the municipality. Based on what Robert said, the project, an abatement must be necessary for the project's feasibility. Again, this is that but-for idea. And the applicant is responsible for demonstrating that the project would be feasible only with the abatement. If the abatement were not provided, then the project would not be feasible according to the regulations and the way that the regs are set up to grant these incentives. Our finding was that the application does not adequately define the project or the standard for determining feasibility from the developer's perspective. The application is conceptual in nature, does not commit to a specific project plan. Is it a hotel or residential? Will or will not the 4th Avenue Theater be preserved? The developer's cost of capital is not discussed in the application, nor do they provide a minimum acceptable rate of return. And one or the other of those two things is really what we think is necessary to determine a project feasibility, along with a concrete plan, obviously. The applicant has requested that any information on the return on capital investment be held as confidential, so we won't be getting into that. Our financial modeling process, we actually did a fairly rigorous look at the information provided in the analysis. We started with by trying to recreate the applicant's financial model and then to estimate feasibility from a returns perspective. And they looked at feasibility from the return on capital, the perspective of return on capital. We then migrated all of the information from the application into an Excel program. We tried to use the applicant's logic to regarding deferrals and other assumptions in generating our project thing. And then where they didn't state their assumptions, we had to go out and find other reasonable assumptions. Our second step then is to select and find reasonable ranges of various economic and project variables that we thought were important and helpful in determining a range of feasibility, such as the capital cost, that's the cost of borrowing money, lease rates for space in the office building or in housing projects, vacancy rates at hotels, interest rates on the cost of capital, retail rents, etc. All of these things we went out and found what we thought were reasonable and usable rates and variables. Then we did a relatively rigorous simulation of the uncertainty within the project, basically using what is known as a Monte Carlo analysis, where you make draws from all the distributions of all the variable elements of the project. We performed 10,000 random draws and iterated the analysis to find a kind of an average return on investment, and came up with a set of results. Essentially, all of these things and all kind of future economic projects, the results are variable and uncertain. You're never going to be exactly right on any project that you're looking at into the future, unless maybe you're a different economics firm. I don't know. We're never exactly right. There's always uncertainty. What we found is that the range of revenues and expected tax revenues, for example, fell within the range that was estimated and provided by the applicant. In other words, our financial analysis basically correspond and came up with essentially the same sets of numbers that the applicant does, with a wide range of variability on top of them. So basically we're saying that the information that they provided in the application checks out. So then we want to look at the effect of the property tax revenues. According to the applicant, if the 4-5 project is completed, the net present value of tax revenues could be as high as $34 million over the next 40 years compared to $6 million under the status quo, and that difference is $28 million. And the tax revenues are supplied in the confidential version of the document, so we can talk about that. We evaluated the range of tax revenues to be $8 million to $58 million under the project. So we had a broader range of tax revenues. Again, this is revenues to the municipality compared to the status quo. We actually took into account a lot more additional variation than was actually specified in the application. Things like microeconomic and macroeconomic factors that could come in and affect the development. Our analysis estimates additional economic impacts above and beyond just the feasibility, and these were based on empirical data, key informant interviews, in-plan software which generates multiplier effects. You've probably seen those when you've been reviewing projects in the past. And these multiplier effects generate estimates of economic output, estimates of employment and income as monies roll through an economy. So it's not just, here I spent $100 and that's the effect. It's I spent $100 and from that other people generated money and they spent money, and so the total economic activity might end up being $200. Or I got a job and so therefore I bought some clothes and now the person at the clothes store gets a job because, so these multipliers are also taken into account under our analysis. And a point that we wanted to be clear on is that our assessment focused on additional benefits. In other words, new activity that would be generated as a result of the project, rather than activity that would likely have occurred elsewhere in the municipality. And what we're saying there is that, if I have an office building, is that going to, for example, bring new companies into Anchorage that wouldn't have otherwise been here? Because if there's already office buildings and everybody in Anchorage has a place to work, an office building in and of itself doesn't generate additional jobs. It has additional space. There is additional jobs generated in the construction of the office building, but the office itself doesn't mean you're going to have additional companies filling those offices. So, again, new economic activity will be generated through the development and the construction of the project. When you build something, there's jobs, there's income, there's economic activity. So you always get economic activity when you're making something. You'll even get economic activity when you're tearing something down, because you're paying people to get out there and do the job. And that's real value and real benefits. So we count all of that activity in the construction and even the deconstruction of the derelict hotel as part of the benefits. However, most of the employment and economic activity that takes place during operational phases of this development are most likely not to be new economic activity. And the way to ask yourself about that is, okay, I've got a new hotel, it's lovely, it's wonderful. Are there additional bodies coming into Anchorage because that hotel exists? The same as I've got a new office. Does that mean that Northern Economics is going to go out and hire 20 new people so that we can occupy that office space? The new economic part of that, you need to show that new activity is coming into it. Otherwise, you're really just moving dollars from one pocket to another. It represents a siphoning off of jobs and incomes from pre-existing businesses, in other words. So, with that in mind, we wanted to go back and look to see how retail space has done in Anchorage, and this data came from the Department of Labor and Workforce Development, the Anchorage or Alaska Department of Workforce and Development. And there was a significant increase in new retail space. You all know this in Anchorage over the last 10 to 15 years. Cabela's, Sportsman's Warehouse. But if you look at the total number of retail jobs in Anchorage, that number has remained relatively flat in spite of what you would consider pretty significant growth in the retail sector, not generating a whole lot of new jobs. The same is true with hotel rooms. In Anchorage, hotel rooms have nearly doubled since 2003, an annual average growth rate of almost 7%. A lot of new hotel rooms in Anchorage. The number of jobs in the accommodation sector in Anchorage, however, has only grown at an annual rate of 1%. So this is just demonstrating that if you build a new hotel, you're not generating the same level of jobs. It's really kind of redistributing that activity. We do think that there could be new economic activity during the operations of the building if the development included a hotel and if there are increases in convention sales at the Denina Center. The hotel that was talked about was a high-end hotel, a very good-sized hotel, and in speaking with the folks that visit Anchorage, they were relatively excited about this and estimated that a nice new 4- or 5-star hotel would generate, they think, 2 new big citywide conventions each year on average, with maybe 1,000 delegates each. And this is where I was talking about, where there's new economic activity that you can say these are people that wouldn't be in Anchorage spending their money otherwise. And so we do think that a new hotel would have that benefit. There may be other benefits, but they're more difficult to point out. Further, with the convention, each new delegate would spend $162 on average, we estimate, over 3 nights. These are actually Visit Anchorage numbers, and that generates a $972,000 in additional hotel revenues, and also in additional bed taxes. There would be additional numbers. And also each delegate would spend an average of $200 per day in eating and drinking establishments. So there are definitely new economic activity that we could say very likely would occur with the hotel if it came to pass. We also looked at the total economic activity and income generated. This is an in-plan analysis, and we brought into this analysis the new conventions. We note that if they put housing in instead of a hotel, you wouldn't have the new conventions, and you would instead have the housing projects. Housing would also generate new employment incomes in the construction, but harder to say that it would incentivize people to move to Anchorage to bring new economic activity to Anchorage, or whether they would just move from one place to another place. Anyway, we developed a table here. This is on the left side, it's the total economic activity in dollars, millions of dollars. On the right-hand side, it will be household income generated from these activities. And these are, we use the IMPLAN, which is a standard multiplier software The construction impacts with the housing project would generate annualized revenue over a 6-year period of 38 directly, 60 million if after all the multiplier on an annual basis. So $60 million in additional economic activity on an annual basis from 2018 through 23. In terms of household incomes, direct income to the actual employees on the facility, 21 million, and then through the multiplier effect, 29 million altogether. And again, these are estimates, not hard numbers. The numbers with the hotel are in the same range. It's an either or. 65 million overall in annual economic activity during this period when you build a hotel, and slightly more income spread around the city as well. The second set here talks about annual average increases in activity from increased convention sales, and it's about $2.17 million per year because of the sales, direct spending by the new convention delegates, and then that works its way through the economy, generates an additional 1.6 million. So you end up with 3.8 million in additional economic activity that you can kind of point to and say, yeah, that's pretty reasonable. And it obviously generates additional economic income for folks in town. There were other community impacts that we talked about, kind of non-quantifiable, intangible impacts. We created a scoring instrument based on the objectives in the 2020 comprehensive plan. Some of you guys are familiar with that, I think. The downtown plan and AEDC's Live, Work, Play initiative. So we went through those plans, talked about some of the development goals and objectives, characterized those, and did a checklist, if you will, to see whether this project helped that cause, that objective or not. And we basically said yes, no, 1 or 0. Here's our scoring guide. Under the Anchorage 2020 plan, there were 30 objectives, and we thought the project addressed between 5 and 7. A downtown plan, there were 7, and it addressed between 4 and 5. Live, Work, Play, 4 out of 5 objectives. The difficulty with kind of comparing and combining all of these things is that one might be creates new jobs, and the other one might be makes it easier to walk down the street. Those are hard things to compare. Oh, I can walk down the street. Is that worth the same as 50 new jobs? So it's difficult to add these together, combine them. And this isn't the applicant's fault. It's just that there isn't any real way to fully judge these things. So in the end, we conclude that the applicant doesn't provide fully quantify these subjective impacts, not fully enough information. There's no clear direction from the municipality for combining and quantifying these results. The proposed project addresses some, though, but not all of the development objectives. That's what we really are finding. The next part of this looks at historic preservation. We went through the project. It kind of talked about we could do some historic preservation of the 4th Avenue Theater. As you know, 4th Avenue Theater is a historic site. We looked at different ways of valuing that. If elements of the theater are preserved by the 4-5 project, it could have a positive use value and a non-use value, positive non-use value as well. Use value is people might start to use, walk through, buy things, visit the Anchorage Theater. Right now, the 4th Avenue Theater. Right now, we're not really using the 4th Avenue Theater for anything, so we're not really getting any use value out of it. We are generating non-use value out of it. Anybody who looks at the theater and says, that's a lovely building and is proud of it, has some non-use value. Everybody who sees it probably has some emotion involved in it. If some people say, that's a derelict building, we should tear it down, they're probably not generating any non-use value. But the rest of us who are saying, you know, I saw some lovely murals in there, and I'm proud of the fact that we as folks in Anchorage have preserved that building. Then that's the non-use value. That I'm proud of that. And that's there, and people technically would be willing to pay for that. So there is a value there. Very difficult to put a dollar and cents on it. I certainly am not going to come out there and say, oh, this is worth $43 million. It's not something I'm going to do. There are people that do that sort of analysis. The 4th Avenue Theater's structural and decorative elements are sufficiently unique such that the destruction of the theater could result in a significant loss then of that non-use value. And that's pretty much the fact that it is a historic building. That's, if you tear down one of these buildings, then you've lost something. And that you've lost the non-use value of it. So that's the end of my talk. Are there?
Thank you very much. We have some questions.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Evans.
And this might be more of a comment for Mr. Harris, but in your presentation, it seems like the whole gist of this thing for all this time was that the project that was submitted was not sufficiently specific really in order to evaluate anyway. And your presentation says that the applicant did not present a project for evaluation in this chapter. I guess my question is, why is that not a threshold question? Why do we evaluate, how much potential conventioneers are going to spend on dinner when the project is not specific enough to really even give that level of attention to? We didn't know what it was going to be as a hotel, a residence, or any of that. Why didn't that cut it off months ago before any significant analysis?
Thank you, through the chair. Mr. Evans, that's a great question. It's a big project. It's an important project. We'd love to see if we could make it work. In this case, though, after looking at the application, there were just enough questions that I felt that it was important to go ahead and hire somebody, bring them in, have a look at it. Let's go through the economics. Let's run through their numbers. Come back to this question of, have we actually got a project? And then in meeting with the applicant, where I basically said, look, how do we resolve these things in the months and years ahead? And was told, go back to the application. So, in hindsight, I think that's something that in the next time around, if this comes around again, I think I will be more assertive about saying that in fact, it's just not ready yet. And that would be something I would be comfortable doing the next time.
May I follow up? Different topic generally, but and this is not necessarily specific to this project, but in the entire scoring and economic analysis, I've been in cities, and there are a number of cities that really have been turned around by projects, especially in their core area, their downtown area, that really became a catalyst for redevelopment, throughout. I'm familiar with Cleveland. We built a stadium, and all of a sudden the whole city changed overnight. Just about restaurants went in, bars, the whole dynamic changes. And in this analysis, it doesn't seem. We and I think it may be because of how the statute is actually limits us in now analyzing it. But it seems like we would need going forward, and the next time this comes up, an analysis that is more dynamic in the sense that and now you can't quantify necessarily what's going to happen, but at least takes into account some of those catalytic probabilities that a project is likely to have. Because of this project, the exciting thing about this project was, at least the grandest vision of this project, most people could see it as really being a game changer for downtown. And not that it was just gonna be static, this was the whole value of the project was gonna be, okay, this comes in and then what happens because of this. So it's more of a comment that, I think our analysis needs to at least find a way to, although you can't do it necessarily objectively, quantify in some regard those secondary and tertiary benefits. That makes sense.
Through the chair, Mr. Chairman, I think that's a really good observation about perhaps some of, if you will, some of the limitations of trying to do tax incentives either through exemptions or deferrals on a project at this stage.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Mr. Evans, Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'd like to echo a lot of what Mr. Evans said. And I'd like to say, I'm a little more familiar with Oakland and with Washington, D.C., and I've lived in Washington, D.C. and seen how development can transform a neighborhood. And I would be interested if you are able to, talking about going in and trying to maybe change the statute in such a way where we can learn some of the best practices of other cities and how they have used these kind of developments, and then taking that more dynamic view of the transformative ability of some of these projects. That being said, I have a question for you on the analysis. And I get, in some ways it doesn't matter because, as Mr. Evans said, there's a threshold question. Your analysis is, while good, kind of irrelevant to the question of whether or not we go forward with this because it's not specific enough, that's not specific enough. But I did want to kind of ask you to clarify one of the statements you made about the housing option. So you said that housing wouldn't necessarily lead more people to move to Anchorage, it might just lead them to move from part of Anchorage. But that seems to be, to me, intentional with a lot of what we have heard from, for example, we received a communication from the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce recently that said there's a housing shortage. I've spoken with Bill Popp, and I know he's communicated to other people. AEC, when they talk to employers, they find difficulty getting good, high-quality housing for professionals when employers are trying to get them to move to Anchorage. And this is an issue when they're trying to get professionals to come to Anchorage, so our housing stock is seen as expensive and inferior. And so I'm wondering if, with your in-plan analysis, was it the kind of housing you're proposing specifically that you didn't think was going to lead people to move to Anchorage, or was it housing more generally? I think you clarify.
Well, I think we really didn't have a good feel for what kind of housing it really was. I'm not sure. Is that?
If that's in the confidential and
Yeah.
non-confidential portions, okay. Hang on, let me look. I believe that's probably in the confidential part. To speak about the exact, maybe I should say this, that the concept of housing was sort of weighed against the concept of a condo, sorry, through the chair, Mr. Dunbar, as opposed to a specific type of housing. As I recollect, it was simply, it could be this or it could be that. I'd be happy to go take a look, though.
So, but I guess to get my question, for the analysis you did, was it based on a specific kind of housing, or was it based on housing more generally? Is it your assertion that housing more generally won't cause people to move to Anchorage?
I think it was the assertion that we made really was based on, in general, are more people going to be moving to Anchorage? Because of additional housing.
Okay, well, I guess gotta say I disagree with your conclusion. Based on what we've heard from other parties, at least that doesn't seem to be the message we're getting from the Chamber of Commerce, from people who are talking to employers. That housing does seem to be a barrier to entry for professionals coming into this market. But I certainly agree with that.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Weddleton?
Robert, I guess. What does the code say for what kind of design level they're supposed to bring? Like, a lot of our stuff says you got to read 35% or 65%. But if you're a marginal project, you want to spend a ton of money getting the 35% design and then find out you don't get the tax abatement. Does it address it that specifically, how detailed the designs are?
I think through the chair, Mr. Weddleton, AMC 1235, Chapter 1235 does not. It simply speaks to a applicant bringing a project forward that meets the requirements of Chapter 1235 And doesn't speak to that it has to be a 35% conceptual or 60% conceptual. And that might be one of the things that's beneficial as we go forward, thinking about what are some possible tweaks we could do to this particular chapter of the code to be able to provide some guidance both on the applicant's part and on the municipality's part.
Thank you, Mr. Middleton. Mr. Trainee?
Since we've only got about 8 minutes left, I'll keep it short. Mr. Harris, when you met with Ms. Gray Jackson and myself, you said that part of the problem was the lack of additional information coming from the applicant.
Mm-hmm.
So who said they would not respond to this? Was it Mr. or Mrs. Fang, or which person?
It was Mr. Fang, the father, who, as I asked several times, and then I think Mr. Schutte might have asked the same question as well, how do we work through some of these preconceptual ideas in the months and years ahead, that as this project moves forward, that we're going to end up with something gets better defined. It's not 813,000 square feet, it's 600,000 square feet. How do we anticipate that and be able to work with you so that we can make this project succeed? Mr. Fang was quite clear that he only wanted us to consider what was in the application, and he said that more than once. I think it's respectful to listen to what he said. That was also said within the context of not wanting us to have conversations with the consultants, either the attorneys that were helping or the architects, planners, Agnew Beck. They didn't want us to be having sort of series of conversations with them. They wanted that to go through their family. So, but really the one question I had, which I think he was really quite clear on, was how do we work this going forward?
Well, that's my question to you, is how do we work this going forward? Or is this, in fact, done for this project? If the assembly asks you to take another look at it again, and you request more information, can this project be survived, or is it just dead now with this document? Because it's an AAM coming to us. AAM, the assembly can either accept or not accept and ask you to look further into it. So my question is there any more data you could get that would help you, in your opinion?
Through the chair, Mr. Trainee, I think at this point in time that we're probably some time away from this applicant being ready to come back to us with a project that's sufficiently well-defined to meet the requirements of the existing AMC 1235. I can't speak for them, so I don't know. They may have a different view, but and I would defer to the attorneys in the room with respect to AO 2015-49 and the guidance it provides on when the application was due and those sorts of questions, and whether or not a resubmittal would be appropriate or not.
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Mr. Evans?
Is Chris back there still?
No.
I thought he was here.
He was.
Okay. There was talk after we did our survey of Oklahoma City and Wichita last year, I think it was last year, about changing or developing for Anchorage some sort of broader economic development tool, whether it was TIF financing or something else that we did for tax deferral locally. Is there anything? I mean, I haven't heard from Chris recently. I don't know if that's gone anywhere. My former compatriot, Ms. Johnston, really wanted to get that done before she left, and she just ran out of time, basically. But it does seem like this project is an example where we basically shoehorned it into the deteriorated properties thing, because that's all we had, and there's even some question about Key Bank being part of that. But it does seem like we need a much broader incentive program for development, and I just wondered if the administration was working on it.
Through the chair, I can hazard a partial answer to that. So the broader difficulty with all of this property tax exemption and deferrals is that much of it is controlled by state law. So on the economic development side of the ledger, we have pretty clear sideboards for what we can and cannot do under Alaska Statute 2945.050. And my understanding is that we have been working the legislative process to see if we can't massage that statute to let us do things that we think would be more productive. The deteriorated property tax exemption by some contrast is a little more nebulous, and we do have more room to revise our statute if that's the interest of the assembly.
I'd just like to see that, that be one of our top legislative priorities next year is fixing the state law so that we can have a more robust program of our own.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Mr. Steele?
Yeah, it's just a question of timing and risk. You know, the owners of the property, they want certainty in terms of what they're gonna get in terms of rate of return. We want certainty in terms of not just the economic benefit, but also the benefit to the residents of Anchorage in terms of the development. We may be just stuck in a place right now where economics are too much up in the air to decide whether or not folks want to go forward. I would like to see us keep it alive if we can, but I don't want to give the farm away either. And, it's our responsibility to shoulder the burden for one another. We may decide it's what it is, and the developer may decide, well, that's what it is, we'll hold on to it for another 10 years or whatever. I would be inclined to try and move it along, but I'm not willing to give the farm away to get the development. And I think we've erred on the side of pretty generous benefits in what we've already done so far. I certainly see where the city's coming from in terms of we don't have enough information, but we're never going to have perfect information either. So we've just got to decide how much risk we want to take as to the developer.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. It just seems that at this point in time that this may be too speculative. We can't project exactly what type of building is going to be, what the project's going to be, so we can't project what the exact effects on our economy are going to be. And so there's just too many unknowns to put us in a strong position to make a really intelligent decision. So the conservative thing to do is to not stick our neck out and risk giving them a large tax abatement that could come back and bite us at a later time, so to speak. That's how I'm reading it.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Dunbar?
So this question is for my colleagues and for Mr. Harris. I think it's just basically I want to follow up on what Mr. Trady asked. If we accept this AIM at the meeting, what practically is the effect? Is there an appeal process for the applicant? Do they have to submit a new application? What exactly does this do?
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Ms. Ennis?
Mr. Chair, I think I can answer that. An AIM is a non-action item, so you're just being informed by the CFO. You can take no action. The applicant can then come back to either the administration or directly to the assembly.
Thank you, Ms. Ennis, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Flynn, do you have any questions?
Nothing from me, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Harris?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to circle back to Mr. Dunbar's earlier question, in the non-confidential portion of the application, they write that a tower spanning 4th Avenue to 5th Avenue with residential or hotel, office, retail uses, or retail amenities and activities on the lower floors for both private and public activities. So to answer your question about housing, the application that I can discuss wasn't specific enough about whether it's the mansion in the sky or if it's workforce housing. Your point to be that certainly we need more housing, we need certain additional types of housing in the municipality. There wasn't enough specificity here to say this housing will in fact bring people to town versus for people to move from South Anchorage, for example. So,
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Okay, Mr. Fang, thank you for being here. I'm gonna allow you a brief moment if you'd like to make some comments.
Sure. Through the chair. Firstly, I want to say the presentation by Mr. Harris and Mr. Harley is very informative. You know, in my opinion, you know, we're talking about obtaining information, or in this case, the lack of information. And I want to clarify this once and for all here in the room. You know, from the owner side, we made our engagement, our effort to meet with the mayor back in October last year. And then again, we made our effort through the consultant, Chris Beck, to have an appointment with Mr. Harris and his team. And, you know, throughout the timeline that Mr. Harris had showed during his presentation, we did turn in the application along with the forma and financial statements back in September 30th. You know, we're supposed to get a response back in 90 days, which is December 29th. I received a letter from Mr. Harris. It was actually advance dated, but it was delivered to the wrong PO address with the wrong zip code. So we received that letter late, saying that they need more time to review the process. There was no period given this in terms of the duration of the time extension. So through that period, in the middle of January, we made an effort to meet with Mr. Harris when my parents were in town, and then through the team with Barbara, my attorney, and then also the team of Agnew Bank. And then at that meeting, Chris Schutte was present, and then also the attorney Ralph was in the meeting as well. And I'm here today to clarify what Mr. Harris has said about what my father had told him and what was not to be assumed. Yes, my father said the 280 plus pages of application is very substantial. There's a lot of information that he could refer that indirectly to, you know, in relation to the project. And we did clarify and told Mr. Harris that with the point of contact, rather than consulting or direct communication with the attorney or with the consultant, let's direct it and have Derek Chang, my brother, to delegate the process so that we could funnel all these tasks specifically and who we need the help with. And that was made very, very clear. Moving the timeline forward, the extension, the letter that we received back in late December, early January, stated that they were required another 60 days. So February the 29th of this year had passed. We did not receive any calls or any emails or any fax. Came March, again, the letter was advance dated for somehow, and I received the letter on March 6th requesting that, we're now looking into a third-party consultant team to look at, to review the application. We'll let you know when it's ready. Again, zero communication, no phone calls, fax, emails, text messages of the sort. I mean, the presentation Mr. Hardy had given is a very good, lengthy, detailed one. But, you know, I have to agree with Mr. Dunbar, you know, it's, you know, and also Mr. Evans is, you know, there's the whole purpose and point of this project is about vitalization, not revitalization, but vitalization of downtown. And the consultant had looked at it, you know, as he shared with us, you know, he looked at it with a micro and macro approach. But I think it's actually a very micro approach. You know, yes, we could look at the convention center, this and that. But, you know, on one hand, you're talking about something very specific, and you're criticizing the application itself is not specific enough. You know, so I'm you know, there's a lot of questions, right? And gosh, you know, I wish we could throw back 3 months ago and had received a personal call from you or from or from Mr. Mayor's office asking us those questions, right? Even letting us know that, okay, the city had chosen Northern Economics to be the consultant. That would be great. I actually have never received that disclaimer disclaimer or disclosure signing the confidential agreement. I didn't know that you were a consultant up until yesterday. You know, I mean, anyway, I just want to clear that in the air.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fain. Mr. Trainer?
Just one quick question, one quick comment. We've done economic curated property status before, one time called McKay Building. And everybody in town said he would never restore that building. He did in fact take curated property status and restore that building to Bible status. It can be done. It's just a matter of having that political will, economic reality to make it happen.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Trainer. Thank you, Mr. Trainer.
Madam Chair, if I may,
Can you
I
make it
request-
brief? We have another event to go to.
Okay, can I just have Mr. Potter speak on my behalf for 1 minute?
Briefly, Mr. Bonner.
Very
Thank
briefly.
you.
As a participant in this, and unfortunately I was not at the meeting in January, so I'm reading both sides about that. I believe that there's a communication issue here, going back and forth, and both sides are probably guilty, not to point any blame, but everybody should accept some blame. This is a very important project for the city at a very important time. Lack of communication is not a healthy thing. If there's additional information that should be brought forward with a list, my personal request would be that this is so important that there should be a remand back to the CFO and the municipal staff to put together a list of questions that would have made it easier for them to respond rather than being purely in the dark and apparently unwilling or believing that they were told not to bother to call. Get those on the table. Give the participants and the applicant the ability to review that, coordinate and communicate that with the staff. Then also establish a rapport in discussing what does the city really need, because there seems to be a lot of information about the need for housing, and there is a lot. And I do not believe that Northern Economics or the CFO has fully contained or considered that, and the work that the Housing Committee through Woodward Clay, through their surveys, with most of the big industries in the city, have identified what the key housing needs are and where those need to be. And it's right in downtown, workforce and extensive housing. So I don't think there's been adequate communication. We can get there. Other cities have figured this out. We have the latitude to do the good work for the community and see if this project is merited and financially feasible. Lastly, I do not believe that Mr. Hartley or the CFO understands, Mr. Weddleton touched on it. This is a $200 to $274 million projected project, depending on how it goes. The cost to get to a 35% design is in excess of $10 million. That's an extensive risk at this time in the marketplace for anybody to take. I doubt that the CFO or that Mr. Hartley would do that with their own money at this time, without knowing that they had something contained in the deal. This should be a performance-based approach. As the FANGs perform, the city should commit. The city wants more commitment out of the FANGs do a little bit more work. To get to the 35% design, we're going to have to go through the city process of platting, conditional uses for building over the rights of way, and all of that. So $10 million is a lot of money. To get the full design is about $27 million.
Please, because we need to go to another meeting.
There is a lot more information, and if we could all simply go back to the table and communicate with each other, I think we'd both be able to learn from each other and get some.
Thank you very much. Ms. Merkel, this is adjourned.